That was all it took for Buckingham Palace to plunge the entire world into chaos. 3 minutes between a press alert and Meghan Markle being spotted at LAX, moving faster than anyone had seen her move in years. 3 minutes that felt less like royal protocol and more like the beginning of a war. And the question that millions of people are asking right now is simple. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What did the palace discover that forced them to announce a move to strip royal titles with the kind of urgency normally reserved for constitutional crises? Because something about the timing, 3 minutes exactly, feels too precise to be coincidence. Too sharp, too surgical, as if someone inside those palace walls wanted Meghan Markle to hear the news before anyone could water it down, before anyone could soften the blow, before anyone could protect her. Why? Why now? Why this? And most importantly, what did Meghan do the moment she saw the notification on her phone? She ran. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. She sprinted. Witnesses said they saw her abandon a half-finished conversation, grab her bag, and make a beeline for the airport lounge like someone racing to stop a bomb from detonating. People online compared her expression to someone who knew exactly what the announcement meant. Others said she looked terrified. Some said she looked furious. One person claimed she looked betrayed. But what do you think? What emotion would make anyone, especially Meghan Markle, drop every plan, every appearance, every carefully organized media moment, and drag herself across the ocean to a country she once vowed she would never return to without security, without respect, without dignity? What exactly was she afraid the palace might reveal? Because this wasn't a vague rumor. This wasn't speculative gossip. This wasn't sources close to the family suggest. This was an official announcement. A deliberate, undeniable, signed off by multiple departments statement of intent from Buckingham Palace. The royal household has begun the internal process to reconsider and revise the Sussex titles. For years, people joked about it. Take the titles. For years, commentators dismissed it. It'll never happen. For years, the palace insisted. No decisions have been made. But apparently, decisions had been made. They had been made behind closed doors. They had been made after consultations. They had been made quietly, secretly, strategically. And this moment, was the moment they chose to pull the trigger. Why? Because someone inside the palace had forced their hand. Someone had delivered something. Something heavy. Something sensitive. Something powerful enough to push King Charles and his team to take the most explosive step the monarchy has taken in decades. And as you're about to see in this story, that something is what Meghan Markle hurried back to the UK to stop, or at least to spin, or at least to understand, or at least to confront. But let's rewind. Not too far, just hours before the announcement, when the atmosphere inside the palace was already shifting. It started with unusual movement. Staff entering rooms they normally didn't. Senior officials staying late. Advisors receiving calls labeled urgent. People who have worked there for decades said they could feel it. Something was coming. Something big. Something no one wanted to speak out loud. And then, the press office was instructed to prepare a statement. The order came from above. Not an assistant. Not a mid-level aide. Someone with authority. The staff didn't even have time to debate it. Not this time. Not when the wording needed to be precise, cold, and unarguable. You know that moment right before a thunderstorm, when the air becomes thick and electric, and everyone falls unnaturally quiet. That was Buckingham Palace on that morning. Phones buzzing, doors closing, printers running, whispers, glances, silence, tension so sharp you could feel it through the walls. And then it happened. The statement went out. In a single moment, the world's media lit up, breaking news banners, red alerts, screens flashing across every network. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's titles are under official review. And here's the part that will haunt Meghan forever. She wasn't notified privately first. She found out the same way the rest of the world did. Through the press. Imagine that. Imagine that level of humiliation. Imagine that level of message sending. If the palace had wanted to show goodwill, they would have called her privately. If they had wanted to maintain tradition, they would have notified Harry first. If they had wanted to maintain peace, they would have given advance warning. But they didn't. They went public before going private. Which means the palace wasn't just informing her. They were signaling something. A shift. A decision. A consequence. and Meghan understood the message instantly. The moment she saw it, cameras captured something extraordinary, not staged, not rehearsed, not polished. Pure instinct. She grabbed her passport. She grabbed her phone. She called no one that the cameras could see. She walked quickly, then faster, then almost in a run, straight toward the nearest departure gate. You don't move like that unless you're scared of losing something you cannot replace. And say what you will about Meghan Markle, her strategies, her intentions, her scandals, her reinventions. There is one thing she has never willingly surrendered: control. But this moment wasn't about control. This moment was about survival. Because even though Meghan left the UK years ago and built an entirely new brand in California, without her titles, without her royal connection, without the weight of the monarchy behind her name, what does she really have left? A brand built on influence. A brand built on status. A brand built on the allure of royalty. And if that disappears, if that's taken away, what happens to the podcast deals? What happens to the documentaries? What happens to the appearances? The sponsorships? The charity patronages? The invitations? The prestige? The negotiating power? What happens when Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, becomes simply Meghan? She knows the answer. The palace knows the answer. Hollywood knows the answer. And that's why she moved with urgency. But the real question is, why did the palace pick today? Why right now? Why with 3 minutes notice? Why with no warning? Why without even giving Harry a call? Unless someone forced the palace into action. Someone delivered evidence, testimony, or documentation that left King Charles with no choice but to act swiftly before anyone could interfere. Maybe before Meghan could launch a media counterattack. Maybe before her lawyers could prepare statements. Maybe before certain information could be buried. And here's where things get even more unsettling. Multiple palace insiders reported that, in the hours before the public announcement, a convoy of vehicles arrived through a side entrance. Not flashy vehicles. Not marked ones. Not the usual advisors. Black cars. Windows tinted. Escorted. Confidential. People inside those cars reportedly carried sealed folders. Locked briefcases. Digital devices that were immediately handed to palace technicians. And shortly after those arrivals, the announcement was drafted. Coincidence? Or was that the final moment King Charles received whatever he had been waiting for, whatever triggered a decision years in the making? But while all this was happening inside the palace, something else was happening online. Social media exploded. Speculation erupted. Memes flooded every platform. Some mocked. Some supported. Some demanded action. Some screamed conspiracy. And yet, beneath all the noise, one question kept rising again and again. What does this mean for Meghan's position? Because stripping titles isn't symbolic. It's strategic. It removes influence. It severs royal privilege. It shapes public perception. It affects how governments treat you. It changes how media covers you. It even affects legal arguments. It removes the last thread connecting Meghan to the monarchy she has built her entire narrative around. And maybe that's exactly why she rushed back. Because she understood that once the review starts, once the wheels begin turning, once committees and legal teams begin their work, it becomes nearly impossible to stop. Which is why the moment Meghan's plane touched down in the UK, something quietly shifted in the political landscape. Cabinet ministers were briefed. Security teams were informed. Advisors began preparing talking points. International correspondents activated. Because everyone knew. This was no longer just a family issue. This was a constitutional matter. A precedent-setting moment. A global spectacle. And yet Meghan still had no idea what she was walking into. She didn't know who initiated the investigation. She didn't know what evidence had surfaced. She didn't know who had stabbed her politically. She didn't know what new revelations were coming. But she was about to find out. Because someone was already waiting for her in London. Someone she never expected. Someone who held answers. Someone who was ready to tell her something she never wanted to hear. And when Meghan stepped out of that car and finally came face to face with the person who had been pulling strings behind the scenes, what happened next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It happened at 9:03 a.m. Not 9 o'clock. Not 9:05. Not the usual top of the hour time when royal press releases are traditionally pushed out. No, 9:03 a.m. An oddly specific moment for a global crisis. A moment no one predicted. A moment that shattered whatever quiet existed inside Buckingham Palace, and ignited the kind of media inferno usually reserved for abdications, deaths, or constitutional emergencies. But here's the part that people still can't agree on. Was the timing chosen to send a message? Or was it chosen because the palace simply couldn't wait another second? Because according to insiders, they didn't have 3 more minutes to spare. Imagine waking up, scrolling through your phone, expecting the usual headlines, and instead, you see it. Buckingham Palace confirms official review of the Sussex titles. 12 words. 12 words powerful enough to detonate the internet. And within seconds, everything broke. Newsrooms scrambled. Editors yelled. Producers ran. Twitter froze. TikTok exploded. YouTube went into meltdown. Even major TV networks interrupted live programming. One journalist said it felt like watching an earthquake in real time. Another said, "I've seen royal drama, but I've never seen the palace move with this kind of speed." People weren't just shocked by what the announcement said. They were shocked by how it was delivered. No leaks, no warnings, no hints. Just a sudden, sharp, deliberate detonation. Like a thunderclap from a clear sky. And that's exactly what the palace wanted. But why? Let's go inside the moment. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was already strange long before the statement went out. Staff members later described an unusual heaviness, doors opening and closing with urgency, advisors whispering behind pillars, coordinated movements between departments that normally function independently. Something was brewing, something big. And then, out of nowhere, the order came. Release it. Now. The press office didn't even finish their tea. Phones rang. Screens lit up. Aides typed so fast some reportedly made typos that had to be corrected mid-transmission. One staffer said, "It was like someone had pulled a fire alarm. That's not normal for Buckingham Palace. The royals move with glacial speed. Everything is planned weeks, months, sometimes years ahead. But this was action. This was precision. This was urgency, which means something forced their hand. Let that sink in before we go further. Someone or something pushed the monarchy into immediate, public action." But while the palace was vibrating with tension, the world outside was blissfully unaware, until their phones buzzed at 9:03. It was the kind of alert that makes your stomach drop even before you read it. And in living rooms across the UK, jaws fell open. People stared. People rewound their TVs. People grabbed their phones and took screenshots. People gasped audibly in supermarket aisles and on buses. Because for the first time, the monarchy wasn't just frustrated with Harry and Meghan. They weren't concerned. They weren't evaluating. They were acting, and acting publicly. That alone sent shockwaves. But here's the part almost nobody noticed right away, something that would become critical later. There was no mention of Harry in the first statement. None. Not his role. Not his opinion. Not even a hint that he had been consulted. Just the announcement that the Sussex titles were under review. Plural, but pointed. And the omission of Harry was louder than any mention could have been. Why would the palace deliberately leave him out? Was it an attempt to separate him from Meghan? Shield him? Or isolate her? That silence would become one of the biggest questions in the hours that followed. But let's return to those first minutes. Every news organization desperately tried to get confirmation from royal insiders. Most were stonewalled. A few got cryptic comments. One source reportedly said, "This is bigger than you think." Another said, "Something came to light. Something serious." But here's where things take a strange turn. 3 minutes after the statement went live, yes, again that same number, Meghan Markle was seen at LAX. Not strolling, not posing, not smiling, not performing, running, like someone who had just had the ground ripped out from under her. Eyewitnesses reported she looked as though she had been blindsided. One traveler said Meghan's phone was still in her hand, screen bright, notifications pouring in. That means she saw the announcement in real time. And she didn't wait. She didn't call a press team. She didn't release a statement. She didn't even appear to consult anyone around her. She just moved. Quickly, tensely, with a sense of panic she couldn't hide. Why would she react like that? Ask yourself honestly. What would make a woman who vowed never to return to the UK without ironclad assurances of safety suddenly rush back with no planning at all? What had she been afraid the palace might reveal? What had she believed was safely buried? What had she assumed would never surface? Those questions buzzed across social media like hornets. Yet the shock wasn't just global, it was immediate inside the palace, too. Multiple insiders say the royal family's phones lit up as reporters and government officials demanded clarification. Certain departments were caught off guard. That alone is astonishing. Major announcements are normally coordinated far in advance, which suggests one thing. Not everyone inside the palace knew this was happening, at least not until it was too late to stop it. But someone knew. Someone orchestrated it. Someone timed it. Someone decided that 9:03 a.m. was the moment they wanted the world to look directly at Meghan Markle. And if you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear why. Because within minutes of the public announcement, something else happened. Something subtle, easily missed, but deeply telling. A sealed vehicle convoy entered a private courtyard at Buckingham Palace through an unmarked gate. Not tourist traffic, not deliveries, not staff. Something official, something secretive, something weighty. And shortly after their arrival, the palace communications office shut its doors. Literally. Locked. As in, no one goes in, no one goes out. That kind of lockdown only happens during national emergencies or extremely sensitive internal crises. So again, what forced their hand? Let's break down the possibilities. A leaked document? A private conversation recorded? Financial evidence? Diplomatic pressure? A staff member turning whistleblower? A senior royal losing patience? We don't know yet, but we do know one thing. Whatever it was, it hit the palace like a lightning strike. The abruptness of the announcement isn't just odd, it's unprecedented. When the Duke of York lost his military roles and royal patronages, the palace prepped for days. When Harry and Meghan first stepped back, there was a month-long negotiation. When the Queen passed away, multiple departments had coordinated scripts. But this was raw, immediate, undiluted. And that alone suggests crisis. But here's the part the public still hasn't fully digested. This wasn't a disciplinary slap. This wasn't symbolic. This was the opening of a legal and constitutional process to remove royal titles, something so rare and delicate that monarchs typically avoided unless absolutely necessary. So why now? Let's look at the timeline. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, several unusual things occurred. A former royal staffer abruptly resigned with no explanation. A member of parliament filed a request to review the couple's status. A well-known journalist hinted on live television that a shoe is about to drop. A royal biographer posted a cryptic message suggesting truth has a way of resurfacing. Coincidence? Or coordinated movement? And then there was one more detail. 3 days earlier, a private meeting was held at Clarence House with select advisors. No one outside the inner circle knows what was discussed. But after that meeting, King Charles reportedly became unusually quiet and withdrawn, something multiple royal watchers noticed. It was almost as if he was preparing for something, or bracing himself. Now, let's flip perspectives. Imagine being Meghan at that moment. You're in California. Your brand relies heavily on your royal connection. Your public image, your deals, your philanthropy, all orbit around that title. You wake up. You check your phone. You see the palace has begun the process to take it all away. And not privately, publicly. Wouldn't you run too? Wouldn't you feel the earth crack beneath you? Wouldn't you suspect that someone, somewhere, had betrayed you? Because in Meghan's mind, this announcement couldn't have come from nowhere. Someone must have pushed it. Someone must have fed the palace something damaging. Someone must have hit the one nerve she feared most. Titles aren't just status. They're leverage. They're currency. They're power. Without them, everything changes. Her public identity, her influence, her global image, her negotiating strength, even her future projects. And if you think Meghan didn't understand that instantly, think again. She has built her entire post-royal life around being the Duchess of Sussex. Not Meghan Markle. Not Meghan Mountbatten-Windsor. Not Meghan the actress. But Meghan, the Duchess. And at 9:03 a.m., that identity was suddenly under threat. Which brings us to perhaps the most chilling part of this entire moment. When reporters asked the palace for clarification whether the king had spoken to Prince Harry before the announcement, a spokesperson responded, "No comment. No comment. Not yes. Not no. Not conversations are ongoing. Not the family is in communication. Just silence." That silence echoed across the internet like a warning shot. Was Harry blindsided too? Was he consulted? Did he disagree? Did he support the move? Or was he frozen, caught between family and marriage? That question would become one of the biggest storylines of the day. But back to the palace. Because minutes after Meghan was spotted rushing into the airport, something extraordinary happened in the press room. Reporters received an off-the-record comment from a senior palace insider saying, "This marks the beginning, not the end." The beginning of what? A punitive process? A constitutional proceeding? A complete reevaluation of the Sussexes' role? Or something even more serious? If this was just an isolated decision, the palace would have calmed things. If this was routine protocol, they would have explained the procedure. If this was symbolic, they would have said so directly. But they didn't. They hinted at escalation. As if Meghan rushing back to the UK was not the shocking part. As if the real shock was still coming. And that leads us to the next critical question. What did Meghan think she could stop by showing up in person? She couldn't stop a vote. She couldn't stop the king. She couldn't stop Parliament. She couldn't stop the Privy Council. She couldn't stop public opinion. So what was she going back to do? Unless she wasn't going back to stop something. She was going back to confront someone. Someone she believed had betrayed her. Someone inside the palace. Someone with influence. Someone with access. And in the next chapter, we're going to explore exactly who that might be and why their role in this crisis is far bigger than anyone first realized. Because the announcement was only the spark, the fire was already spreading behind closed doors. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started as a whisper, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur in the corridors of Buckingham Palace. Someone said a few words in the wrong room. A document appeared where it shouldn't have, and within hours, that whisper became a storm that would change the trajectory of Meghan Markle's life and shake the royal family to its core. Because here's the thing no one expected. The palace's decision to strip Meghan of her titles wasn't just a bureaucratic move. It wasn't simply an administrative review. It was a response to a leak. Someone, somewhere, inside the palace, had shared information so sensitive, so volatile, that the monarchy had to act immediately. But who? Who would dare betray the Sussexes, and why? That question hung in the air as aides and advisors scurried between offices. Security personnel tightened their grip on restricted areas. Even veteran staff who had seen decades of royal upheavals admitted they had never witnessed anything like this. According to sources, the leak was meticulously calculated. Not sloppy. Not accidental. Not a careless intern posting a draft online. No, this was precision. Surgical. The kind of leak that could alter public perception, destabilize a family, and force swift action from the king himself. And the content? That was worse. Multiple insiders have reported that the leaked material contained highly sensitive correspondence, internal memos, and communications between Meghan and third-party contacts, documents that outlined decisions, strategies, and plans that the palace never intended to see the light of day. Some of it was alleged to challenge royal protocols. Some of it suggested breaches of internal agreements. And some hinted at information that could be interpreted as personal or damaging in the wrong hands. It was enough to send shockwaves through the royal household. But here's the twist that most people missed. The leak didn't come from a single source. Early investigations suggest multiple points of origin. Someone inside the administrative wing. Someone close to the legal team. Perhaps even someone trusted by senior family members. And all of them, intentionally or not, funneled information to the same place. A network of journalists, royal biographers, and influencers ready to ignite the story. Think about that for a moment. Inside Buckingham Palace, an institution built on discretion, loyalty, and centuries of secrecy, someone had broken ranks. Not for personal gain necessarily, but for influence, for leverage, for revenge, or perhaps out of fear of what Meghan might do next. And the palace had to react. Imagine being King Charles at that moment. Sitting in your office, reading reports that sensitive information has already escaped, understanding that the media storm is about to hit before any damage control can begin. Every royal advisor looking to you for guidance. Every member of staff bracing for fallout. And the clock is ticking, so the announcement goes out. Fast, public, immediate, with the precision of someone aiming to seize the narrative before Meghan or her team could respond. And yet, the leak's identity remained a mystery. Even those at the highest levels could only speculate. Everyone involved had a different theory, and the palace had to navigate this carefully. The wrong accusation could escalate tensions, alienate allies, or even trigger legal consequences. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle is watching it all unfold from California. She doesn't yet know the specifics of the leak, only that someone inside the palace has undermined her, and the consequences are about to reach her personally and publicly. She senses it instantly. That electric shock you feel when betrayal cuts deep. That gut punch when you realize someone you once trusted is working against you. And so she does what she does best. She moves. She makes the calculation, weighs the risk, and decides she has to be physically present. She has to confront. She has to reclaim some semblance of control before the narrative becomes irreversibly damaging. But let's pause on the mechanics of the leak itself, because it's astonishing in both scope and audacity. Documents didn't just appear. They were strategically accessed. Some were digital, stored in encrypted systems only senior staff can reach. Others were physical, hand-delivered notes, handwritten memos, even letters carefully tucked into folders intended for internal circulation only. The fact that any of these made their way into the hands of outsiders demonstrates a level of planning and opportunism that is almost cinematic in scale. And that's when the panic inside the palace began. Meetings were convened at unusual hours. Legal teams gathered behind closed doors. Security reviews escalated. Every phone line and email account was scrutinized. And somewhere in the middle of this chaos, aides whispered, "We need to act now." That phrase became the catalyst for the 9:03 a.m. announcement. The palace realized that delaying, even by a few hours, would give Meghan's team time to strategize, to respond, to spin the story, to seize the narrative. In the world of media and public perception, timing is everything. And the palace needed to strike first. But the leak had another, more insidious effect. It created internal suspicion. Every senior advisor began looking at one another with a mix of fear and distrust. Who had shared the information? Who could be trusted to handle the crisis? And, crucially, who was still loyal to Meghan versus the crown? Imagine the tension. Staff who had been working together for decades, suddenly eyeing one another like potential traitors. Conversations that were once casual now carried weighty subtext. Every decision, every move, every word had to be measured carefully, because a misstep could further escalate the leak or expose the palace to scrutiny. And what of Meghan's allies? Reports indicate that several close contacts in her team were equally anxious. They knew the leak was real. They knew the palace was about to act. And yet, they had no concrete information. Only speculation. Only urgency. Only the understanding that the next hours could define Meghan's public image for years, perhaps forever. Which brings us to the heart of the crisis. The leak wasn't just a bureaucratic problem. It wasn't just a legal issue. It wasn't just an internal scandal. It was a psychological blow. It forced Meghan to confront a reality she may have hoped she had escaped. It reminded her that, no matter how far she fled geographically or socially, the palace, and its influence, still had reach. And it forced action. 3 minutes later, she was on the move. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. The leak itself may not have been intended to trigger immediate action. Some sources suggest it was meant to be a slow drip, a controlled release to pressure Meghan into compliance or negotiation. Yet the palace interpreted it differently. They saw urgency, threat, and the need to act decisively before the situation spiraled beyond control. And that, ultimately, is why everything moved so fast. The palace couldn't afford to let Meghan or her allies shape the narrative first. They had to define it. They had to control the optics. They had to be the first to signal authority, consequence, and control. So when the announcement hit at 9:03 a.m., it wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration. A signal to Meghan, to the public, and to the media. The palace was not only aware of the leak, but ready to respond. Ready to act. Ready to enforce. And yet, as powerful as that announcement was, the real story, the one that would soon unfold, was still hidden. The leak had set the stage, but it was only the opening act. What came next would reveal motivations, alliances, and betrayals that no one had anticipated. And as Meghan raced across the Atlantic, unaware of every subtle maneuver happening inside the palace, she was walking straight into a game that had been in motion long before her plane even took off. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. She didn't walk. She didn't stroll. She ran. Witnesses later described it as a blur. A woman with purpose, moving faster than anyone thought possible for someone of her status, sprinting through the bustling terminals of LAX as if the ground itself could betray her if she lingered. Her passport clutched in one hand, phone in the other, eyes darting, calculating, strategizing. Every muscle tensed, every step deliberate. Why was she moving like this? Why the urgency? Why the complete disregard for appearances, cameras, or even the small army of aides and security she usually traveled with? Because in that moment, Meghan Markle understood one brutal truth. The palace had set in motion something she could not ignore. Something that could not be stopped from California. Something that required her immediate presence. And the media noticed. Everyone noticed. By the time she reached the departure gate, whispers had begun circulating among travelers and staff alike. Cameras snapped. Phones recorded. Live streams caught the rare sight of a royal moving with raw, unfiltered intent. Social media exploded almost instantly. Clips of her dash were uploaded within minutes, captioned with disbelief, admiration, speculation, and outright shock. Some called it a sprint for survival, others a tactical move in a high-stakes chess game. One user wrote, "She's running not from paparazzi, but from the ghosts of the palace." And maybe they were right, because while cameras focused on the drama, Meghan's mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about public perception or social media clips. She was thinking about consequences, about what could happen if she didn't make it to London fast enough, about the documents she might see, the confrontations she might face, the decisions that might already have been made in her absence. Every step she took was a calculation, every breath measured. And yet, there was something almost cinematic about the scene. The contrast of chaos around her, the clatter of luggage, the shouts of passengers, the rolling of carts, and her unwavering, almost single-minded focus. Nothing could distract her. Nothing could slow her down. Not the cameras. Not the onlookers. Not the security checkpoints. Not the small armies of fans and reporters trailing behind. It's important to understand why this moment mattered so much. Meghan had already left the UK once, leaving behind titles, privileges, and an entire public identity. She had chosen a life across the Atlantic, built her brand, secured her voice, and crafted her narrative as someone independent, as someone untouchable by the structures of monarchy. Yet in a matter of hours, that identity, her carefully constructed public persona, was under threat. And the palace was not subtle in its approach. They wanted to send a signal. They wanted to show power. They wanted to remove any doubt that Meghan could act without consequence. So she ran. Because in Meghan's world, speed equates to agency. Action equals survival. Presence means influence. And yet, even as she raced, the obstacles were enormous. Airports are chaotic at the best of times. Flights can be delayed. Security checkpoints are meticulous. Boarding processes are precise. And she had to navigate all of this while maintaining control over her narrative, her image, and her emotional composure. The stakes were astronomical. Not only was she rushing across the ocean, but every misstep, every hesitation, every delay could be leveraged against her in ways the public could not yet see. Eyewitnesses describe a scene that reads like a thriller. A royal woman, seemingly unaccompanied in her urgency, glancing at her phone for updates, pulling her luggage with one hand while signaling security with the other. She was aware of cameras, yet her focus was elsewhere. She seemed to be calculating timing, assessing flight patterns, perhaps anticipating what awaited her upon arrival. The sense of urgency was palpable. It was as if she carried the weight of an entire story, one that had already begun to unfold without her, and she had no choice but to catch up before it spiraled out of control. Consider the logistics for a moment. This wasn't a casual flight. It was a transatlantic journey during a period of intense media scrutiny. Every airport official, every airline employee, every security detail had to be coordinated. Seats had to be arranged. Documentation had to be verified. Protocols had to be followed. And yet, despite all these hurdles, Meghan navigated them with determination and focus that left onlookers stunned. Meanwhile, inside the palace, officials were already monitoring the situation. Private contacts in London and Los Angeles relayed updates. Every movement, every boarding announcement, every delay was scrutinized. Palace aides reportedly watched as Meghan progressed through the terminal, as if tracking a storm in real time. They knew her arrival could complicate matters. They knew her presence could influence decisions. They knew she might arrive with a strategy, a challenge, or a counter-narrative that no internal memos could anticipate. And here's where the tension deepened. Meghan's arrival was not merely a personal choice. It was a public act of defiance. By rushing to the UK, she was sending a signal, not just to the palace, but to the world. She was announcing that she would not be sidelined. She would not be ignored. She would confront. She would demand answers. And she would reclaim control of her story, even if it meant facing threats she could not fully predict. Her team, though mostly unseen, played a critical role in this dash. Legal advisors coordinated from remote locations, providing guidance on immigration, documentation, and strategy. PR consultants monitored social media in real time, preparing for the inevitable backlash and speculation. Security teams evaluated risk, ensuring her safe passage through crowded terminals and onto the aircraft. The entire operation was a delicate balancing act between speed and control, urgency and discretion, action and optics. It's fascinating to imagine what Meghan was thinking as she moved. Did she anticipate the exact reactions from media outlets? Did she predict the frenzy that would erupt online? Did she consider the potential confrontations awaiting her upon arrival in London? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But what is clear is that every move she made in that terminal was designed to maximize efficiency and minimize uncertainty. Because in her world, uncertainty is the enemy, and speed is the ultimate weapon. And then, as if orchestrated by fate itself, she boarded the plane. No delays, no hesitation, no second thoughts, just swift action, executed with precision. Passengers reported that she remained composed but focused, occasionally glancing at her phone, occasionally consulting with her personal security detail, occasionally scanning the cabin as if anticipating a storm yet to arrive. The aircraft doors closed, and the engines roared to life. Meghan Markle was in transit, literally racing against time, perception, and an unfolding royal crisis. Yet even as the plane ascended into the sky, the tension did not dissipate. In fact, it escalated. Every moment of flight brought her closer to the heart of the palace, and every mile carried her further into uncertainty. Who would greet her upon arrival? Which senior royal would confront her first? Would the leaked documents be waiting, or had the palace taken steps to secure them? Could she even influence the decisions that were already in motion? And so, in that moment, one fact became abundantly clear. Meghan Markle's dash through the airport was not merely a physical journey. It was symbolic. It was strategic. It was emotional. It was a declaration, a message, a prelude to a confrontation that the monarchy, the media, and the public had all been anticipating but could not fully comprehend. Because by the time the plane touched down, Meghan would be stepping into a world where every move, every word, every expression could be scrutinized, politicized, and weaponized. A world where alliances could shift in an instant. A world where the palace, her family, and the media were all players in a game with consequences far beyond what any observer could imagine. And yet, despite the stakes, despite the uncertainty, despite the storm that awaited her, Meghan moved forward. She ran. She boarded. She flew. She refused to be passive. She refused to be silent. She refused to be sidelined. Because in her mind, speed equaled power, action equaled survival, and presence equaled control. But little did she know. The challenges awaiting her on the ground would test every ounce of preparation, strategy, and courage she had left. And what came next, the confrontation, the revelations, the power plays, would be even more explosive than the dash itself that he didn't speak. Not immediately, not publicly, not in private statements, not to his closest advisors, not even to the friends who had been with him through decades of scrutiny, betrayal, and triumph. For Harry, silence was never just silence. It was language. It was strategy. It was a shield and a weapon. But this time, it was also fear, uncertainty, confusion, and, perhaps, a hint of guilt. Because the announcement from Buckingham Palace wasn't just a public shock, it was personal, and it cut deep. Imagine being Harry in that moment. You're on the other side of the Atlantic, away from the epicenter of royal power. You know the palace has released a statement that could fundamentally alter your family's story, your wife's identity, and your own position in the monarchy. And you didn't see it coming. Not in its timing, not in its precision, not in its immediate public exposure. Sources report that Harry spent the first hour after the announcement in near silence. Calls went unanswered. Messages ignored. His team was reportedly scrambling to reach him, unsure whether to advise him to speak, act, or simply wait. Even his closest aides admitted to tension they hadn't felt in years. Because what they realized instantly was this: Harry had no room for error. One misstep, one public word, could inflame the palace, derail Meghan's strategy, or fuel media speculation in ways that could become irreversible. One word too emotional, too defensive, too revealing, and the narrative would no longer be theirs to control. So he stayed silent. But silence is rarely empty. Inside those walls, or rather, across the oceans and in his private residences, Harry's mind raced. He ran scenarios. He predicted leaks. He imagined confrontations. He analyzed how the palace might respond to Meghan's dash. He considered the implications of the leaked documents. He calculated what the media might focus on, what public sentiment might shift toward, and how his own actions, or lack thereof, could either protect or harm the family he had chosen to distance himself from. Silence, in this context, was strategic. Perhaps, but there was also tension, a gnawing anxiety that, despite all his planning, he might be too late. That Meghan might arrive and face consequences before he could intervene. That the palace, the media, and the world might witness a confrontation he could neither control nor influence. And yet, in that same silence, there was another element: suspicion. Sources suggest that Harry immediately suspected someone inside the palace had orchestrated this precise timing. Someone who knew exactly when Meghan would see the announcement. Someone who understood the psychological impact it would have. Someone who wanted to manipulate both Meghan and Harry, to put them on the back foot. And here's the irony. Harry's own instincts, sharpened by years of scrutiny, press attacks, and palace politics, told him that responding too quickly might play into the very hands he feared. That perhaps inaction, at least temporarily, would allow him to gather information, observe reactions, and position himself strategically. Which leads to the million-dollar question. Was Harry's silence actually strategy, or was it panic? The line between the two is thin. Advisors reportedly debated this in hushed tones. Some urged immediate public statements. Others cautioned restraint. Legal teams advised assessing the palace's next moves before committing to a response. PR consultants considered the optics of Meghan racing to London while Harry stayed quiet. International news organizations speculated endlessly. Social media spun narratives. Some accused Harry of betrayal, some defended him, and some simply asked whether he even understood the magnitude of the moment. And in the middle of all this, Harry's private life, a life already intertwined with media speculation, became a minefield. Every friend, every relative, every confidant had an opinion. Every opinion carried potential consequences. And every decision, every word, every silence, was weighed against the potential fallout. Sources reveal that Harry spent part of the day walking in private gardens, pacing, making phone calls to legal advisors, occasionally consulting Meghan's team remotely. He monitored flight progress. He tracked social media. He watched news coverage. And through it all, he remained painfully aware that he was walking a tightrope between family loyalty, public perception, and personal ethics. Because this wasn't just a family disagreement. This was a constitutional matter. A matter of reputation, inheritance, privilege, and legacy. A single misstep could impact not just Meghan, but him, his children, his future, and the monarchy itself. And yet, despite the stakes, the reports indicate that Harry was preparing to act. Not recklessly, not publicly, not impulsively, but decisively, strategically, and privately. He knew that Meghan's dash to the UK would bring her face-to-face with the palace, with the advisors, with the documentation, with the decision-makers. And he knew that if he arrived unprepared, he could be sidelined entirely, watching as the narrative was rewritten without him. So he waited. But waiting is dangerous, especially when the world is watching, especially when the palace has already timed its moves. especially when leaks and rumors are swirling faster than any official statement. Because inaction can be interpreted as weakness, silence can be interpreted as agreement, waiting can be interpreted as abandonment. And Harry knew all of this, which is why sources indicate that he began plotting his next steps carefully. Not just a statement, not just a presence, but a strategy. How to influence the decision, how to intervene before it became final, how to protect Meghan, and perhaps, in the process, protect himself. The irony is brutal. The same family institution he once believed he could escape, by moving to California, building a life, establishing independence, was now pulling him back in with terrifying speed and precision. And despite all his distance, all his planning, all his attempts to create a new path, he was ensnared once again. And yet, the public didn't know any of this. The cameras didn't capture his thought process. Social media didn't capture his strategy. Only silence. A quiet, almost eerie silence that masked a storm brewing in private. And then came the first breakthrough, an unexpected call from someone inside the inner circle. Someone close to the palace. Someone Harry had trusted. The call was brief, coded, and chilling. It revealed that the palace was not only aware of Meghan's movements, but had anticipated them. That they had prepared for her arrival. That every possible outcome had been considered, every countermeasure deployed. And that Harry's window to influence events was closing fast. And in that moment, the weight of reality hit him. Meghan's dash, while courageous and urgent, might not be enough. The palace had anticipated everything. The leaks, the announcement, the timing, the media, everything. And Harry's only leverage now would be his own rapid decision-making, his own strategic intervention, and his own ability to maneuver through a maze that had already been designed without him in mind. So the question became, would he act? Would he remain silent and let events unfold? Or would he intervene, knowing every move could escalate tensions further? The tension was so palpable that even Harry's staff reportedly felt it as a physical pressure. Calls were monitored, decisions debated, legal contingencies planned. Every advisor understood the gravity. One wrong move could tip the balance irreversibly. And yet, despite the chaos, the uncertainty, and the looming crisis, Harry's silence persisted. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon is restraint. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. But as the hours ticked by, it became increasingly clear. Meghan's arrival in the UK, Harry's cautious strategy, the palace's preparation, all were converging toward a single, explosive confrontation. And when that confrontation came, the consequences would be enormous. Not just for Meghan and Harry, but for the monarchy itself. And what came next, the secret meeting at Kensington, would reveal just how deep the web of strategy, betrayal, and loyalty had become. Hours before Meghan's plane touched down in London, a black car slipped silently through a side entrance at Kensington Palace. Windows tinted, engine humming softly, security alerts minimized. A vehicle that shouldn't have been there drew barely a glance from passers-by, if they had even been aware of it. But inside, the palace knew. Officials tracked every movement. Every arrival was calculated. Every passenger scrutinized. And the occupants of that car? They carried the kind of information that could change everything. This was no ordinary meeting. Inside one of the lesser-known conference rooms, normally reserved for administrative briefings or ceremonial planning, doors closed behind the few individuals permitted entry. Whispers stopped. Phones were silenced. Cameras were prohibited. And for nearly 2 hours, Kensington became a nerve center of secrecy, strategy, and intrigue. So who was in that room? No one outside the palace could say with certainty. Reports suggest a mix of advisors, legal counsel, and a key figure with influence over King Charles's decisions. Some sources hint at the presence of a senior royal, though their identity remains undisclosed. Others suggest the meeting was convened specifically to review the latest developments regarding Meghan Markle's titles, her impending arrival, and the leaks that had triggered a chain reaction across the monarchy. And what was discussed inside those walls? The details remain classified, but multiple insiders have confirmed the gravity of the conversation. They examined timelines, communications, and potential contingencies. They debated legal ramifications, media responses, and public perception. And, crucially, They considered Meghan's imminent arrival and the potential consequences of her confrontation with the palace. Imagine it. The room tense, voices low but urgent, advisors weighing options that could reshape the monarchy, the Sussex's public image, and perhaps even constitutional precedent. Every phrase mattered. Every word carried weight. Every recommendation could be the difference between controlled damage and full-blown scandal. Some staffers described the atmosphere as almost cinematic, like watching generals planning a battle they had no desire to fight, yet were forced into by circumstance. Maps weren't spread out, but digital timelines, flight itineraries, press schedules, and communications logs created a similar sense of strategic intensity. And then there was the unspoken question that hung in the air. What would Meghan do when she arrived? Advisors debated the possibilities endlessly. Would she confront a senior royal? Challenge the process? Attempt to sway public opinion before the palace could define the narrative? Or would she attempt to negotiate privately, hoping to reclaim control over her status and identity? Each scenario carried risk. Each scenario could escalate into public spectacle or private humiliation. And the room understood one undeniable fact. The clock was ticking. Every minute Meghan was in transit brought her closer to the heart of the storm. The meeting wasn't just about planning. It was about anticipating, predicting, preempting, and, if necessary, controlling every outcome. Sources indicate that one of the most heated debates centered on how to handle sensitive documents that had already been leaked. Some argued for immediate public disclosure to regain control over the narrative. Others recommended keeping them confidential until Meghan's arrival to maintain leverage. Tension rose, voices occasionally elevated, but decorum prevented outright confrontation. What's striking, insiders say, is the sheer complexity of the decision-making process. Removing or revising royal titles isn't like revoking a job title in a corporation. It carries historical, legal, symbolic, and international implications. Every action would be scrutinized, analyzed, and debated across the globe. A single misstep could spark backlash from media, politicians, and the public. And yet, every moment of delay increased the risk that Meghan could preemptively influence the story. As the debate raged, advisors also considered Harry's potential reaction. Would he arrive in London? Would he remain in California? Would he act publicly or remain silent? The room discussed every possible scenario because Harry's presence or absence could dramatically affect Meghan's decisions, the palace's approach, and ultimately, the unfolding media storm. And then there was the most sensitive question of all. What would Meghan do with the information already circulating? Insiders report that this was the turning point in the meeting. Discussions moved from logistics to psychology. Predicting Meghan's moves required insight into her personality, past decisions, and pattern of behavior. Advisors debated her known tendencies, her decisiveness, her boldness, her penchant for action, her ability to turn adversity into narrative power. They considered how she might attempt to negotiate, manipulate, or challenge the palace's authority. And they recognized that, if underestimated, she could seize control of the story in ways no one could predict. This is where tension peaked. Because for the first time, the palace had to consider the possibility that Meghan's arrival wouldn't be reactive, it would be proactive. She might not simply respond to the situation. She could attempt to shape it entirely on her own terms. And that possibility made every advisor in the room uneasy. Sources suggest that at one point, a senior figure leaned back, eyes narrowed, and said, "We have to assume she's already 10 steps ahead." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the gravity. Every plan, every contingency, every precaution had to anticipate not only what Meghan would do, but also how she could influence global perception, media coverage, and public opinion. And then, as the meeting drew toward its conclusion, a decision was made. Preparedness over caution. Anticipation over reaction. Action over delay. The palace would set its narrative first. They would define the process, the timeline, and the message. They would secure documents. They would prepare spokespeople. And they would be ready for Meghan the moment she stepped off the plane. Because by the time she arrived, the game would already be in motion. The meeting concluded quietly, almost imperceptibly. Attendees dispersed, some heading to private offices, some returning to security posts. others exiting the building entirely. But in that moment, Kensington Palace became a silent battlefield, a theater of strategy where every move mattered and every miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. And yet, despite the preparation, despite the planning, despite the intense focus, one unpredictable element remained: Meghan herself. No plan, no leak, no strategy could account entirely for her decisiveness, her boldness, her sheer determination. And that uncertainty, the human factor, loomed over the palace more heavily than any briefing or document. Because Meghan was approaching. And when she did arrive, the confrontation that everyone had anticipated, debated, and prepared for would finally occur. And what came next? The reveal, the confrontation, the unexpected twist, would leave the palace and Meghan both scrambling in ways no one could have imagined for years. The royal family has operated with a strict code: loyalty, discretion, and silence. What happens behind palace doors stays behind palace doors. Until now. Because for Meghan Markle, everything she had assumed about security, discretion, and loyalty was about to be challenged, publicly and ruthlessly. Sources indicate that when Buckingham Palace announced the review of Meghan's titles, it wasn't a spontaneous decision. It wasn't merely a response to gossip or speculation. It was triggered by evidence, a collection of documents, communications, and internal notes so sensitive, so meticulously detailed, that it forced the palace to act immediately, with zero warning. And it wasn't just the timing of the evidence that mattered, it was the content. Reports suggest the palace's legal team compiled a dossier outlining multiple points that could justify a review. Some sources hint at financial irregularities, others at protocol violations, and still others at private communications that contradicted royal norms. There was even mention of personal correspondence, sensitive enough that if leaked, could impact public perception, political ties, and even Meghan's ability to represent charitable initiatives effectively. Imagine the tension inside the palace when this evidence came to light. Advisors who had spent decades navigating scandals, media scrutiny, and public perception admitted they had never encountered anything with such immediate consequence. The evidence wasn't just damaging, it was urgent, actionable, and inescapable. Some insiders described the documents as the kind of material that could topple reputations overnight. Others referred to them as unprecedented. The palace faced a dilemma: ignore the evidence and risk further leaks, or act decisively and risk confrontation with Meghan. And that decision, according to sources, was made in the hours before Meghan's flight. Now, let's pause and consider the stakes from Meghan's perspective. She had already established a new life across the Atlantic, a life designed to maximize independence, influence, and public presence. Her podcasts, interviews, and philanthropic endeavors had built her brand far beyond the constraints of royalty. But the palace's evidence threatened to strip away her most valuable asset: the perception of authority, prestige, and legitimacy that came with her title. Sources report that the evidence was organized in several layers. The first layer contained official communications, emails, letters, and memos, showing actions or statements inconsistent with the expectations of the royal household. The second layer reportedly contained third-party communications and corroborative testimony, outlining actions Meghan had taken without proper consultation or approval. The third layer, which remains largely undisclosed, allegedly included material that could be considered personally damaging: private messages, strategic plans, and even internal reflections that suggested she had anticipated or maneuvered around palace rules deliberately. For legal and public relations teams, the compilation of such evidence was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it gave the palace grounds to act decisively. On the other, it opened the door to scrutiny, leaks, and criticism of timing, method, and fairness. Every word, every fact, every piece of evidence had to be precise, corroborated, and defensible. But the most controversial aspect of the evidence reportedly wasn't just what it contained, it was how it was discovered. Sources suggest that some documents were obtained through internal audits, while others were flagged by senior advisors monitoring communications for compliance with palace protocols. A few pieces, according to insiders, came from staff members or aides who felt compelled to provide information for the sake of transparency. or perhaps to protect the monarchy. The combination created a dossier both thorough and explosive. And this is where Meghan's arrival complicates everything. Because as she traveled across the Atlantic, the palace was already preparing to present or utilize the evidence in specific ways. Certain senior officials anticipated that she might challenge the findings, attempt to suppress them, or preemptively spin the narrative. That anticipation influenced the timing of the public announcement. By the time she landed, the palace was ready to control the narrative, ensuring that the evidence, once revealed, would shape public perception decisively.